this. One of the essential components here is this idea of self-efficacy and the ability of somebody to have confidence in their own abilities to perform well in the future. And the evidence supports the idea that if you provide some sort of self-efficacy during the concept of practice, then you are going to facilitate learning more. This is very contradictory to some of the mechanisms that I grew up in sport and learning, where you are berated and beat down. And there are some other worlds where people tend to push you down rather than build you up. But the idea is that if you really want to learn and take ownership and be motivated to learn, there needs to be some sort of self-efficacy, and that does facilitate learning. Now, one of the ways to facilitate learning or to promote self-efficacy is this idea of social comparative. And social comparative is comparing your ideas versus those of others, or your scores versus others. Lithwaite and Wolf did a study, and one of the ideas is giving individuals, and there are balanced performances, it's also been done with VO2 max, where you let somebody know whether or not they were better or worse, or if you did not tell them what they were. And we know that if you tell somebody they are producing or achieving a score that is better, then they tend to produce, and the result is they do a better performance than those that did not do as well as they did. Or even if their score wasn't, they were tended to improve at the beginning, they improved over the time and learned the skill better, right? And so what we identify, remember, is we're talking about the retention here. And so there was a greater retention in that control or the group that was told they were doing better than everybody else. One of the things I want you to point out, though, is that this idea of the worst may, by telling somebody they did worse than the other group, may provide a little bit of a motivation for certain individuals. So sometimes we need to know our group of individuals, and sometimes they do better by letting them know they did worse, or even lying to them and telling them they did worse to give them more motivation. But the idea with these studies is that idea that if we support that self-efficacy, there is a more advanced learning through the process, and it is shown through retention in a number of studies. Another one is the idea of perception of task difficulty. And with this golfing study, we're going to focus on these middle circles, and the idea is that these circles are the same size, but the idea is whether or not you perceive one task to be more difficult than the other. Oftentimes, when a circle is surrounded by the smaller circles, the circle in the center is thought to be larger than if it's surrounded by the larger circles, it's thought to be smaller. What this does is talks about the idea of perceiving the whole small or large has an effect on somebody's ability to perceive the task difficulty. Now, the idea is that if somebody believes that they have the perception of difficulty, most of the time, they achieve a lesser production in the process. So their achievement is reduced because of the idea of the process being worse or less effective. Going forward, so if you perceive the target to be large, you have a reduction in score. If you perceive the task to be easy, if you've practiced enough times, or it's something that you have the perception of being smaller or larger, again, self-efficacy is enhanced, motivation is encouraged, and you believe you can succeed in the task. Another concept going forward is essentially the learnability of the task, and whether or not this idea of things can be learned, or whether or not you have a genetic predisposition, or whether or not it's an inherent skill level. One of the ideas that we're going to go forward and talk about is that idea of learn versus fixed. And really, what I want you to focus on is how you believe about things. Are you born to be a basketball player because you're tall and you're just gifted? Or can somebody who is shorter learn to be a more gifted basketball player or football player or any other sport there is? And so people who believe that a task is learnable typically have a greater self-efficacy. They have a positive affect. They have a greater task interest, and they show greater improvements during the practice. And remember, this is all the idea of what motivation is to generate learned behavior during practice. So if I believe I can get better during practice, then I believe it's a learnable skill. I have a motivation to enhance that skill through putting my effort into practice. Now, this study here by Chavosky and Drews was a soccer study. And what they would do is they would give 3 types of feedback to somebody or to the participants. There's an inherent ability, or the generic feedback, which talks about the individual genetic skill of the individual. You are a good soccer player. You have a talent for soccer. You were made for this sport. You were made for that sport. You have a genetic ability. Or things that are non-generic, and these are feedbacks, or malleable skill and feedbacks, where those kicks were very good, or that last kick was great, or that last shot was really good, or and these are things that are taken away from the genetic abilities or the inherent abilities and putting them on the specific activity or task that we just completed, right? And then you have the idea of negative feedback. Those kicks were not very precise, or those kicks were not very good, or you did not kick that ball correctly. And the idea that negative feedback does have very much of a detrimental aspect to the motivation of learning. So what we see here from this test is the idea that in the retention test, the non-generic, which is not the non-genetic or non-inherent ability of the individual versus generic, and this is the accuracy score. The higher the accuracy score, the better they did. So we see that in the retention test, the non-generic feedback group did better in learning the task over the generic group. So those that thought it was a malleable and learnable task. So generic feedback is thought to degrade the intrinsic motivation and the motor performance in children in learning tasks because they feel like it is a genetic, and they lack the motivation to learn the task and improve because they feel that it is not something they can improve on. So the idea is generating and fostering that idea that tasks are learnable and you can increase your skill level. So here we have, if we do this target practice, the idea that you have a talent for throwing, or these throws were very good. And again, what we see here, again, the accuracy score, you have the non-generic, and this time they changed the color coding, so it's the top one, has a greater improvement, in especially as a learned behavior as time goes on. They get more accurate and leaning towards more of the center score. Now we're going to get into this idea of having some sort of autonomy, or the idea that you have some sort of ability to control your feedback. Before we do that, we really want to talk about this traditional idea of feedback, and it doesn't have the optimal accuracy type or frequency for the individual. But there are 2 types of feedback that we need to talk about, and that is the knowledge of performance versus the knowledge of results. And going forward, you're going to see it talked about as KP or KR. But understand knowledge of performance deals with the movement execution, while knowledge of results is simply the outcome of the motion and the performance. So the idea is, can using the knowledge of support benefit, or is it adequate enough to learn the skill going forward? Well, this idea of autonomy of support is, should you allow the individuals who are attempting to learn to have some sort of control over their practice? Now, the important part of this is that, yes, short answer, autonomy and having some sort of ability to control some aspect of your practice. And the key component here is that it does not need to have anything to do related to the task at hand, but it enhances your ability to motor learn. And some of these ideas is just being able to pick the music in the gym, or the environment, or picking some sort of aspect of clothing or footwear, or any one of those things. The Anaheim Angels under Mike Scioscia for a while were allowed, the pitchers on the mound that day were allowed to pick the uniform or the color combination that the team would wear for that game. So the idea is that giving them some sort of autonomy over the day would help them improve. Now, this idea of autonomous support shows superior learning in many things. So decide when the feedback is received, use of assistive devices, the view of demonstration of skills, so how you are viewing the skill, whether it's computer, whether it's video, whether it's first person, third person. Decide in which order to practice different tasks. Do I want to do all free throws before I do layups, or how much to practice? Now the key is going to be, how do you prove that autonomous support is beneficial to learning, and this is where we're going to bring in something that I need you to really focus on. And this is the idea of yoking. Now, it's not yolk like an egg yolk, but it's yoke, Y-O-K. And this is where you have each participant in the control group is paired with a member of the autonomous support. So generally you have three groups. You have a group that is given a designated amount of feedback and when it's controlled. You have a group that chooses when to get the feedback. And then you have a group that is a control group that is paired with a group that is given the autonomous support. And the idea is, the question becomes, how often should we give that feedback in order for it to be beneficial? And so this is what it looks like. You have the knowledge of results in one group, and they remember this, they're only given the outcome. You have a summary group where they reserve the knowledge of performance of their task after every 5 trials. You have a self group, which is the knowledge of performance whenever it's requested, right? So both KR and summary are groups that are designed or are given a designated amount of feedback. And then you have the yoking group, which is given the same amount of feedback as the self group. Now, this is a baseball study by Pagel et al., and I'm going to go ahead and post this study as well, and I want you to go ahead and read it. These are simply the attentional cues. This is how they are doing the transition and how they're given the corrective feedback toward the process. And then here's the results, right? And so again, we were to look at the retention. Here you have the knowledge of results group, the self group, and the yoke group are really what you want to pay attention to mostly. Because here is the self-selected group, the yoking group is here, and then the summary group for the knowledge of performance is here. So this group has been given a designated amount of feedback after 5. So the yoke group matches the same amount of feedback that is given by the self group, right? So what they note is that these individuals have the same amount of feedback and the same frequency of feedback. However, they're given and they have different results in their ability to learn the task. And that has to do with the ability of this individual group to choose and have the autonomy over when they receive the information that they look for. Again, just another way of representing the data. And so the biggest idea with this is that by having some sort of control over the amount of feedback you get, especially with the knowledge of performance and how often and when you get it, is enough to give you the idea. Now the question becomes, why is that, right? And why is it that having a given or prescribed feedback is not important? Well, maybe you feel something during the task that you really want to understand or see what was happening or needs to be improved upon. And so your ability to ask at that point will allow you to focus in on that. And it also gives you a little bit of time to self-analyze through the process of your proprioception and some other feedbacks on how you produced.